Hey everyone, welcome to this webinar related to product management for enterprise software. My name is Ritwik. I'm a product manager at Google, and I'm really excited to share some of my learnings with you. So a quick background on my own experience. So I'm currently at Google, as I had mentioned. I'm working on Google's ad products. Prior to that, I gained most of my experience in Southeast Asia, working at Apple, specifically working on the Apple online store and launching that in China as well as Southeast Asia. I spent some time at Grab, which is a major startup in the region, as well as a few other mid-stage startups, including Easy Taxi, which was a ride-sharing company, as well as Morph Ventures, which is a venture builder in the region. So with that said, one of the key elements that really thematically is common across the board here is that I've had a lot of exposure to enterprise businesses and enterprise business models. That has exposed me to working with sales quite often, working with large advertisers as well as large customers in general. Sorry, I'll just restate that one line. So I'm just taking a pause. One of the key elements that's been pretty common in terms of thematic reference across each of these experiences is that I've had the experience of working with enterprise products, with large businesses that utilize these products, as well as the internal stakeholders that come into play as one develops products for these particular customers. With that said, I believe that there are a few key learnings here that are just too valuable to ignore in terms of building and developing enterprise products today. And I'd love to cover some of those with you moving forward. So when we talk about enterprise products, this might be quite straightforward for some, but what exactly are we talking about? What are some of the common enterprise products that we use on a daily basis? So here are some examples, I guess. A few of them that really must jump off the page would be Microsoft Office and its function as a productivity suite. Sorry, I'll just repeat that as well. Yeah, so given some of the examples that are on the page here, perhaps one that might jump off immediately is the Microsoft Office suite, which is excellent for productivity. As product managers, we may have a lot of experience with Jira as a project management software. Obviously, Slack has grown in popularity as well. And if you work with payments, then Stripe is definitely an excellent enterprise product to look into and to have an excellent experience with. With that said, one needs to recognize, firstly, that there are some fundamental differences in terms of managing and developing enterprise products and products for consumers. Now, when we talk about products for consumers, you can think of Facebook, Instagram, Amazon as an example in terms of its e-commerce business. So these are certain key examples that would stack up against the examples that I had shared in the previous slide. But how exactly are they different? They're seemingly different businesses for sure, but what about from a product management perspective? So I've tried to think of this in three themes over here and try to really lay out why are these products really different. So the first theme is extremely fundamental. So that's just what that business is all about, the kind of customers that you would be working with, and so on. So user personas clearly jumps off the page. For consumer businesses, generally, you tend to work with one type of user. Of course, that one user can have different categories, but that is not as important in this case. From an enterprise perspective, on the other hand, you might be dealing with two different user personas. So you would be dealing with your buyer and your end user. This is not always the case, but it is indeed the use case for a number of enterprise products. There are changes in problem discovery, and also, as I had mentioned, fundamental business models for enterprise versus consumer products. With that said, the second theme that I thought of was operational in nature. So how exactly do you go about making decisions for enterprise products versus consumer products? Enterprise products, for instance, rely a lot more on qualitative data. And so your approach to evidence-based decision-making is a lot more different. There is a lot more stakeholder management involved as well for enterprise products. You obviously work with sales a lot, but there are a lot of other channels and partners that you need to work with and ensure that their needs are addressed to a significant extent. And finally, problem discovery is another area that fits the page here as well. So it definitely was under the fundamental context, but also in terms of an operational mechanism. How exactly do you go about realizing what are the key features to work on? It sort of is ambivalent in that sense. And finally, as a third theme, I looked at it from an execution point of view. So for product managers, build velocity, roadmap strategy, and how exactly you prioritize your different features varies vastly from how you consider these for consumer product management versus an enterprise product management perspective. A simple example here would be prioritization. So for enterprise products, you have large customers who might be, let's say, worth 15% of your annual revenue run rate. If that's the case, you might want to cater to their needs over the needs of the general product vision or the broader customer base. With that said, there are these fundamental differences that exist along the themes that I just mentioned. But for today's particular webinar, I wanted to dive into three particular areas. These are three areas that I have personally had experience with while working across the companies that I've mentioned. But these are also three areas that anyone who is starting off as an enterprise product manager could really focus more on and try and hone their skills in terms of being excellent at their job in this regard. So what are these three areas? So the first one is collaborating with sales. Now, this is definitely something that you would be hearing a lot more of as we move forward here. But sales is perhaps the most critical and the most challenging relationship for product managers. And that might be quite a statement for some. Usually people think of the product manager slash engineer dynamic. That's extremely critical. And while that continues to be the case, sales becomes increasingly more important for enterprise product managers. Stronger ties with sales essentially leads to better products. And that's quite a simple equation over here. The second bit is experimentation with enterprise products. So as I had mentioned earlier, enterprise products generally have a lot of qualitative data available, perhaps not as much quantitative data. Validating any kind of a hypothesis for enterprise products might require a lot more effort, might require a lot more time. And on top of that, any kind of product change that you might want to experiment with and learn more about is often seen to be disruptive because enterprise customers tend to regard consistency in a high manner as far as their product is concerned. With that said, sorry, I'm just going to repeat that experimentation point. The second point is experimentation for enterprise products. So this is a key challenge for any enterprise product manager because product changes that you might want to experiment with are often seen to be disruptive. It's not always a good idea to start making tons of changes to the product just for the sake of experiment. So how do you actually learn more about your customer and how they would react to these particular changes that you're thinking of? On top of that, as I had mentioned earlier, there is a ton of qualitative data available for enterprise product managers to work with. With that said, one needs to take into account how exactly would this play with quantitative data, and one needs to expand one's tool set beyond just A/B testing in terms of experimentation. The final category here is creating a product vision and a roadmap. Now, while the fundamental way in which you talk about roadmaps is fairly similar for enterprise product managers as well as consumer product managers, there is a greater need for a balance between a reactive versus a proactive strategy for enterprise advertisers. Now, sorry, I'm going to repeat that point. I mentioned advertisers instead of customers. Yeah, just a hangover from work, I guess. Let me just repeat that. The third point is creating a vision and a roadmap for your product. Now, while fundamentally similar, this may vary quite a bit for enterprise products in certain characteristics. The first one is the greater need for a balance between reactive tasks and a proactive strategy. And we'll come to that a lot more in the following slides. And finally, customer timelines tend to be a lot more pressing when it comes to enterprise products. So let's say there's a big feature reveal that you want that might fundamentally change the way that your product works and perhaps introduce this excellent user experience. You want to release it, but you don't want to do it at a time that's critical for your customer, perhaps not towards the quarter end, let's say. So these changes are extremely important to keep in mind. And these three areas are ones that I would be diving into. For each of them, what I'll specifically try to do is give a brief introduction about why they're important, talk about what are the key challenges in this regard, and just round that conversation up with some of the strategies that you might employ as a product manager for an enterprise product in order to tackle these successfully. So let's get started. Collaborating with sales. Now, sales is perhaps the most critical connective tissue between you, the enterprise product manager, and your customers. The essential value of sales, if I were to be really reductive about it, is to commercialize your product offering while assimilating feedback. But if you look into this a little closely, sales is perhaps the only stakeholder within your organization that has a 360-degree view of the product. They are the primary channel towards your customer, and therefore they understand exactly what the customer wants, what the customer is reacting like in terms of the product features that you have introduced. And they also have a handle on what product and engineering are working on at their end, how they are interpreting the customer feedback. In essence, if you look at sales closely, they can serve as perhaps the primary channel for problem discovery for enterprise product managers. Now, sales also provides an excellent avenue to vet feature concepts prior to research and experimentation. Now, this goes back to a point that I had mentioned earlier. You don't just want to introduce changes rapidly and at a random pace for your customers, especially enterprise customers, more to say. Instead, what you want to do is, sorry, I'm going to repeat the second point. Now, secondly, sales serves as an excellent avenue to vet feature concepts prior to research and experimentation. As mentioned earlier, you would not want to run an experiment for every small change. What you'd like to do first is perhaps get some initial data, perhaps some direct customer feedback in order to understand, are these changes worth pursuing, or are they just a pipe dream, or should they just be deprioritized for the time being? Finally, because sales has this view regarding the customer, they also have a broader opinion on the industry, and it's really important to take advantage of this. These are factors that makes the value of sales priceless for enterprise product managers. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this relationship is often contentious, and perhaps the first reaction for product managers or even for engineers is to try and distance themselves from sales, perhaps see that they can't work together very well, and just sort of give up on that communication channel. This is especially true in smaller companies. I would caution against that. In fact, I would say that having a relationship with friction, having this contentious channel with sales is a good thing. Our job as product managers is to challenge sales, to challenge them as to why are certain things coming into play, and their job is to do the same. Our essential aim is to help each other succeed, and recognizing that is extremely important to determine how exactly the product can be made successful. Now, with that in mind, let's dive a little deeper. Let's try and understand exactly why do these challenges come about? Why is there this contentious relationship that product managers often refer to when they talk about sales? Now, the first thing is priorities. The way that you have developed a POV regarding your product and the features that it requires might not be the way that sales is thinking about it. And this might be due to a number of factors. Sales is actually seeing your product being used by customers, and therefore they might have firsthand feedback that might not quite agree with your overall vision. So it's important to try and address that. There are also requests that might come in from sales that are not fundamentally driven by an impact on our core metrics. Instead, it might be just because there's a large customer who's important to the company overall, and we would just want to do a little bit of, sorry, just repeating this point. Finally, in terms of prioritization, the additional element here to keep in mind is that there might be some requests that come in from sales simply because certain customers are being extremely vociferous about it. They demand certain changes, or they might be simply large customers that hold a lot of value for our overall business. With that in mind, the objective here is not to drive change or product features because of an improvement in our core metrics or an improvement perhaps in our actual product quality. The impetus is quite different from how product management may view this. And therefore, this leads to a little bit of friction with the sales team. The other bit is misaligned incentives. Now, this is somewhat a point that follows from the prioritization bit. Product and sales might focus on a distinct set of metrics. So, from a sales perspective, they might be chasing a few leads. They might want to get commitment from certain customers to actually use this product, to start paying, and to come on board as a regular customer for our product. But from a product management perspective, we might not be looking at the overall business from just the lens of a few customers. What we might be doing instead is looking at a broad range of metrics. We might be catering to things that might not actually move, regardless of whether a certain customer comes on board or not. And therefore, this creates this disassociation between our incentives from a sales and a product manager's point of view. The other thing to understand here, and this is extremely important, is what really is the incentive for sales? Now, sales is driven largely by performance-based compensation. That's a huge part of their overall compensation package. And it's important for product managers to recognize and empathize with that fact. It's important for sales to hit certain targets. And therefore, while it might be easy for product managers to, let's say, poo-poo a few requests that come in from sales, that might not be the ideal attitude. One needs to understand why these requests are coming in and why is this so important for sales and why are they requesting certain timelines. The final bit is communication. So there might be a lack of clarity from product and engineering's perspective regarding what exactly is going on in terms of the product vision, which is often a key point of friction. This often also comes about because there are obscure processes that product managers might follow within the internal setup. So what that might mean is we might have a prioritization process that we go through. We don't share all the details with sales. We might not take their requests into account properly or get them on board in order to pitch their reasons for a particular change or a particular feature. And having that disconnect leads to further friction. So this is a key area to address. So with that said, how exactly do we collaborate with sales? The first thing comes back to building empathy. As a product manager, we often know about sales. We kind of know what targets they are working on, but we don't really understand their work. So it's useful for product managers to sit in on calls, perhaps lead certain calls as well, sit in on pipeline reviews, try and understand how exactly sales works. This might not be something that you can do every day, but doing this a few times might build some level of trust with the sales team, but more importantly, make you aware of exactly how sales works. What are the challenges that they are hearing? How often do they hear this? And also perhaps answer some questions that you may have in terms of how important certain requests are and whether they can be deprioritized for the short term. The other bit that I would urge product managers to take into consideration is make sales life easier. Build internal tools that sales can use to simplify their internal processes to go about their work in a more smooth and frictionless manner. With that being said, what you're essentially doing is not only just simplifying processes, as I mentioned, but you are empowering sales to perform better, to focus on things that are more important rather than trying to, I guess, correct data that might be questionable within your dashboards or perhaps work through any kind of an internal CRM that is just too difficult to operate. Get them to spend time on things that are most valuable. The next bucket of initiatives that I would urge product managers to take into account is always stress on the why. Now, when you're dealing with a number of customers, as any sales executive might be, there are a ton of requests, and it's natural for some of those requests to be passed on to product managers and to engineers, which in itself builds up. There is a lot of work and a lot of backlog to take into account from a product manager's perspective. But it's important here to try and promote more focus. Now, it's not necessarily something I'm claiming that sales would not be focused, but this is something that we need to proactively take into account. Question sales about why is a certain change important? How critical is this? How massive would this change be beyond this one or two customers that they are serving at the moment? In addition, it's also important to recognize what are the key priorities. So one approach to take from a product manager's perspective may be to just ask what are the top 3 requests or what are the minimum viable requirements for you to commercialize this product. This approach tends to work really well in focusing the entire team, both from a sales standpoint as well as from a product standpoint, and also manage customer expectations. That's a key viewpoint from sales perspective. The final bit is infusing transparency. Now, ensuring clarity regarding product vision, engaging sales early is extremely important. As I had mentioned earlier, let's say you're going through a prioritization process, but you do not once consult sales or you do not have any representative from the sales team sitting during those calls. That is a major breach of trust. You're essentially claiming that you have all the information that you need, which may or may not be true, but simply from a relationship building standpoint, that is not an ideal way to build trust and empathy. Therefore, it's important to have sales participate in those calls and have them participate early on. In addition to that, I would also say that in case you deprioritize or say no to anything, which is a perfectly fair thing to do, communicate your reasons clearly, try and be as quantitative as possible, and try and put this in the context of the larger picture. This would help you move towards a more healthy relationship with sales and would translate a lot more of our planning into action, into actual dollar value, and towards the bottom line. So, having collaborated with sales perfectly, we can move on to now talking about experimentation for enterprise products. Now, thorough research and experimentation are critical for any enterprise product. And I'm being a bit liberal with my definition for experimentation over here. I'm taking into account any initiative that helps you learn more about the product. And that might include user surveys, that might include user interviews that lead to more qualitative analysis, and of course, the range of testing that can be in terms of an A/B test, multivariate test, funnel tests, and so on. The important thing to understand here is that when we talk about experimentation, the first thing that a lot of product managers might think of is A/B testing. And that is a perfectly fair way to approach it as well at first. The key thing that product managers might need to take into account here is that there is a way to expand your toolbox in terms of learning more about your customers, especially for enterprise products. This is particularly important from my perspective because enterprise products tend to be extremely complex. There's a lot of interdependency in terms of different parts of the product, and therefore, using these different tools within your skill set is important to try and learn more about the customer iteratively while mitigating risk. Now, it's easier said than done, certainly. There are several challenges in this regard, and these challenges tend to be very unique in terms of their applicability to enterprise products only. The first one is data quality. I've mentioned this a couple of times already. Often we tend to work with qualitative data when it comes to enterprise customers, and qualitative data is especially important. It helps you answer why. But qualitative data alone is not enough for us to make informed product decisions. In addition, especially for smaller businesses with enterprise products, there might be concerns in terms of having statistically significant data available to you. You might be working only with a few customers. They might be large customers for all you know, but the number of data points that you might gather would be limited. And so your results would have some inherent bias in them. One needs to formulate a way to overcome this. The second one is also related to this in some sense, and that relates to validating your hypotheses. Now, when it comes to market validation, working with enterprise products is a lot more challenging. Oftentimes, market validation requires time. Enterprise products and enterprise customers generally take time to onboard onto these products, onto the new features, get comfortable with using them to a point that they can start providing feedback. With that said, this complicates our entire agile testing methodology, and your common tools that you use in terms of consumer product management might not be as applicable to enterprise products. Again, as I had mentioned earlier, regular changes are also considered disruptive, and therefore enterprise products might require testing, but enterprise customers might not be open to that. The challenge, again, is going to be especially severe for businesses with products that are yet to scale. The final bit here is the absence of an ingrained culture for testing. Now, in the absence of this, not only do you lose out on trying to learn more about your product, but there are also issues in terms of designing well thought out experiments. Now, I would highlight here that it's more important to build an experiment that moves your product strategy forward and not just your metrics. So given that, it's more important to, sorry, I'm just going to repeat the testing culture point. The third bucket of challenges falls under testing culture. Now, an absence of an ingrained culture for research and testing hinders progress, especially of a more strategic form for enterprise. Sorry, repeating that again. Just a second, sorry. The third bucket consists of testing culture. Now, an absence of a testing culture that encourages and promotes product managers to learn more about advertising. Sorry, I'm just making this mistake too often. I'm sorry. Let me repeat that once more.
Don't worry, you're doing great.
All right. So the third bucket of challenges here relates to testing culture. Absence of a testing culture that's ingrained for product managers that encourages us to iteratively learn about customers creates a hindrance to overall strategic progress. There is a lack in general for several product managers of a portfolio approach to testing, which harkens back to the point that I had mentioned earlier, thinking of experimentation in terms of a broader scope and a broader set of tools. So with that said, assuming that there are these challenges with enterprise products, especially for enterprise products that might be at different stages of their life cycle, it's important to understand how can we address this. We can't magically change some of the conditions for ourselves. So for instance, for smaller customers, one might not be able to acquire a large customer base. For smaller companies, one might not be able to acquire a large customer base overnight. But there are some things that product managers can take into account when thinking about experimentation. The first is this concept of staggered experimentation. The idea that I've learned here through my experience is that whenever one is thinking of a project, try and visualize what sort of information would you want to find out at what stage of the development. So let's say you're at a concept phase, you want to answer some generic questions about whether or not you're thinking in the right direction. Perhaps a simple way to learn more would be just a survey. Just try and get some yes/no answers and try and focus on specific points. As you move further in terms of the concept development process, that's when perhaps user interviews, customer interviews might come into play. That's when you might want to understand, perhaps to a deeper extent, some of the questions that had come up through your surveys. And from then on, as you move towards implementation, you can think of A/B testing, multivariate testing, and so on. Taking this sort of a portfolio approach ensures that there is a steady stream of qualitative and quantitative data. And what this would ensure is that in your decision-making process, you not only have the what, but you also have the why and the how. These are important areas to understand before one proceeds with any kind of broad changes regarding any kind of product. The second bit is delving into the point that I had just mentioned, more about the portfolio approach. So again, creating this sort of a distributed approach is extremely important in terms of thoroughly testing your product or feature that you've been focusing on. In fact, one of the ways that it's especially effective is that before you engage in any large-scale quantitative testing, where you might want to try out a few changes to your interface or any kind of a funnel-like test that might require changes across different pages, you might want to learn as much as possible from a qualitative standpoint so that you can define your objectives and your ideal success metric in a better manner. This approach prepares us in the best way possible to experiment only when necessary, and yet ensure that there is a staggered way. Sorry, I'm just going to repeat this point. The second bucket is delving into one of the points that I mentioned earlier to a deeper extent, and that is using this portfolio approach. So the important thing to note over here is that before you engage in any sort of a broad quantitative test, it's important to validate your hypotheses initially with some qualitative testing, with some other means of testing that might focus on a smaller group of customers and thereby preventing any sort of large-scale changes that might have to be rolled back towards the end. The final bit that I would mention over here in terms of tackling these challenges related to enterprise product experimentation would be developing testing efficacy, ensuring that there is a system to design experiments well, to get results that are required, and to reject any kind of proposals that do not pass the minimum criteria that are defined by the experiment. This must inform a holistic product strategy, not just metrics. This is perhaps the key learning when it comes to enterprise product experimentation. The bottom line here being, for any enterprise product managers, it's vital that whether it's at an organization level or a team level or just at an individual level, codify a framework for proposing and designing experiments so that you can ensure quality, control, consistency, and good output across the board for any kind of an experimentation-based initiative. With that said, we move on to the final point that we are going to discuss here, and that's developing a roadmap and vision. So the key takeaway here is going to be that crafting a roadmap and vision for an enterprise product is an intricate balance between a proactive and a reactive strategy. Often, road mapping tends to be a very long-winded process for enterprise products, and that's mainly because you have a flood of information coming in terms of customer feedback. You also have your own vision in terms of what you or where you want the product to head next. And also, there are a number of last-minute requests that often pop up. So feature backlogs often tend to be massive and constantly expanding. The idea here would be, while you should be proactive in terms of planning what features to build, you should keep enough slack, perhaps 25% effort, that should be allocated towards reactive requests. And I'll go into that a lot more in the coming slides. So let's talk about some of the challenges that come up in terms of road mapping and creating a vision for enterprise products. The first one is trying to predict the future. The important thing here is that when it comes to enterprise products, there are a number of themes that are moving together. There are a number of industry trends that are afoot. Some of them might have been recognized, some of them might be a little more obscure. But it's difficult to spot exactly which direction is the industry heading in and what do customers want, unless, of course, you are engaging them almost on a daily basis. So it's important to try and do that in order to get a good hold and a good sense of what your customers would want moving forward. There's also a propensity, especially when it comes to small and medium businesses that are serving enterprise customers, that one tends to live in a bubble. One, as a product manager in particular, one can get attached to one's vision. And so it's very easy to just keep your roadmap intricately tied with where you want the product to go, while the industry perhaps might be heading in a totally different direction. Overall, it's important to try and see that, just checking something. Yeah. Overall, it's important to see that one is able to plan ahead of time, ideally 2 to 3 quarters, but this is definitely easier said than done. Now, the other aspect where planning for enterprise products becomes challenging is determining timelines. So you have generally a limited window for release. So as I had mentioned a few slides ago, you might have a situation where, let's say, there's a financial close happening towards the end of the quarter. Ideally, you don't want to introduce any changes that might be sweeping in nature for your product during that time. Or perhaps there are certain events that are occurring that are critical to your industry. Perhaps you want to line up all the key changes that you've been working on just before that so that you can make a huge marketing push around it. So synchronizing these updates is going to be extremely important. And one needs to balance how disruptive this might be for advertisers, which is, again, a bit of an art rather than a science. And finally, product prioritization. So there are some critical questions that always come up when you're talking to enterprise product managers. The first one is going to be, if you are faced with, let's say, a customer who's contributing 75% of your revenue, which might be the case, again, depending on how big your Sorry, just repeating this. The final point is product prioritization. So this is a common concern that comes up for enterprise products. Let's say you're talking about a customer that is so critical to your business because you tend to be extremely head-heavy. In those cases, how would you prioritize a request that would serve only this customer versus a bunch of other requests that are coming in from the majority of your customers? There needs to be a balance here in terms of how you prioritize these requests. The other factor that comes in to play as far as prioritization is concerned is you may have a number of plans that have been put in place through customer research, getting feedback regarding your product, but there are always some last minute requests. So an ideal example of this would be Apple's changes regarding iOS 14. They were a pretty last minute introduction. Sorry, just repeating this. I don't want to mention this point. Yeah. The other aspect regarding product prioritization is seeking an ideal balance between a proactive approach that takes into account all the work that has already been put in, all the research and analysis that has already gone into framing the product roadmap, versus the last minute requests that come in. Perhaps there's a key blocker, there is perhaps a huge bug that is impacting a large number of advertisers. Sorry. There's perhaps a huge bug that is impacting a large number of customers. How exactly do you prioritize these? Answering these questions is going to be critical for any enterprise product manager. Now, with that said, our solution here is going to be pretty simple. It's actually just a structured and disciplined approach towards product management. It definitely sounds ideal or too good to be true, but some of the steps that I mentioned here would get you at least some of the way there towards having an ideal product management process for enterprise products. The first one is really simple. It's really basic, managing your time and resources. As I had mentioned earlier, ideally, you should be planning at least 2 quarters in advance and should try and move this as far ahead as possible for yourself. While doing so, it's important for product managers and engineering teams to ensure that there is reasonable engineering slack and engineering effort available in terms of resource planning. This is the part of the effort, the component of the effort that goes into addressing any kind of reactive changes. So if you have a 75% of your roadmap already planned, perhaps 25% of your effort or even 10% of your effort could go towards addressing last-minute project requests that might be considered valuable. The second one is leveraging sales and marketing. So again, sales and marketing is your friend. The idea here is that if we can engage sales early and often, we can learn a lot more about the customer. We would have a better idea of not only how the industry is thinking, but also how certain critical customers are thinking. Are they on board with the broader changes that are afoot or not? And what kind of an impact do we expect from these kind of strategic moves? Keeping that in mind, we can actually make a product roadmap that is a lot closer to reality than something that is a lot more related to wishful thinking. The final bit, and this is a point that I didn't really allude to earlier, is marketing. Marketing is critical for warming any communication channels prior to key launches and ensures traction for allow lists. They help you keep your roadmap in play in their own way. Understanding how exactly and do they come into the picture, how do they position your product is vital to getting that last 10% of effort towards your launch process for your project. And finally, this is an important point that any product manager, whether it's an enterprise or a consumer product manager, is often told. Learn to say no, but I would say no often. It's perfectly fine to challenge sales or other stakeholders regarding what to build and why are we using a certain timeline to build a certain product feature. This is going to put in a healthy level of skepticism in the entire process, and in the long term, it definitely helps make the overall product operation a lot more frictionless. The one point to note here, which is something that I had mentioned in the initial point of collaborating with sales as well, it's important that if any decisions are taken, they are documented, and reasons for deprioritization in particular are communicated with not only quantitative data, but also the larger context in picture. It's important to frame this in the right way. With that said, we are rounding up exactly what we learned. So this is what I'd refer to as the key takeaways over here. So product management for enterprise software products is fundamentally different, although it does share several commonalities with consumer product management as well. There are two flavors of the same discipline. Essentially, as far as collaborating with sales is concerned, more than just saying that it's important, the key thing to take away here is that sales wants to help you succeed, as much as it might not seem sometimes because of a rather fractious relationship. From our end, as a product manager for enterprise products, it is our job to strive to return the favor, to help them with their objectives as well. It's not just a one way relationship. In that regard, it's important that we understand their incentives, especially anything that's related to compensation. The second bit I would mention here is that experimentation is more than just A B testing. Always think of this in a portfolio approach. Qualitative data from customer research is always vital. It's important. It answers the why, but it can't be used alone. So you need to pair that with quantitative data always, and doing this in a structured manner, staggered across the life cycle of your project or product is extremely important. And finally, your roadmap should cater to both proactive and reactive requests. A disciplined approach will help you nail the former. For the latter, that's how quickly you can react, how quickly you can react to the market situation. Sorry, just let me repeat the last point. And finally, your roadmap should cater to both proactive and reactive requests. A disciplined approach is necessary for the former, and doing so makes the latter, reacting to any last minute requests, a lot easier. With that said, thank you, and thank you for having me for this. And I'm happy to connect with anyone that has any questions. My LinkedIn is mentioned here. Good luck. Have a great day ahead. Thank you.